So, hello everybody. Today I'd like to invite you to go on a little soundbite with me about horror in role playing games. Now, when you Google horror role playing game and you go to images, this is what you will find, or at least this is what I found. And the question of horror in role playing games, or horror in general, has always been something that I've been interested in. While I'm not somebody who spends a lot of time reading horror novels, I mean, I've read some Stephen King. I've also watched some horror films. I've also read Gothic novels. I always want to, I think, kind of feel chills and thrills. When I play a role-playing game, I expect to be horrified. Maybe only mildly, but I do want to feel fear. And as we all know, H.P. Lovecraft actually wrote about fear, and he said, well, the greatest fear is the fear of the unknown. And in his work, the mythos, this idea of fear and what it does to the human psyche is, of course, quite prominent. And everyone who's ever heard of Call of Cthulhu, the role-playing game, will know that there is such a thing as sanity. And as the horror unfolds in the game or in the books, and the protagonists become more and more aware of what's actually happening, the crazier they become, until such time as they are reduced to gibbering people sitting in a corner unable to function. And I have read all of Lovecraft's work, and interestingly enough, the stuff that I find least horrifying is the stuff where the great old ones come in, or where the mythos is being played out. And I think that is because this whole idea of his protagonists realizing that they are not the pinnacle of creation, that there are things out there that are much older, much more powerful, that probably also transcend the power of the Christian God, who doesn't play any role whatsoever in Lovecraft, is something that as somebody who was born in 1973, I cannot relate to. I was born in a world where we had already split the atom, where we had already used atomic bombs to annihilate many, many people in Japan. We were the kings of the world. I was already born after the moon landing, and after the Apollo program had started. Sorry, not after the moon landing. Was I born? Well, anyway, but I was born when we were already discovering space. Okay, our own solar system. But we were already making our way beyond the confines of this world. So this idea that there might be extraterrestrial life out there was something that we had already become accustomed to. And I still believe, and I know, that there must be other life forms out there. I mean, the universe is so vast. But what kind of a life form we would encounter if we ever met them is a different question. It could be that it's bacteria, and they may not be intelligent or sentient the way we consider intelligence and sentience to work, but they would still be life. So this whole idea of how terrible Cthulhu is not, in my opinion, because he's an outer god representing some kind of extraterrestrial community of gods. He's simply terrifying because he can pick you up and put you in his mouth and chew you up whole. So he's like a great white shark that can kill you. He's like a Tyrannosaurus Rex that, if it was alive today, would definitely be someone that would have humans on the menu, and if we encountered one, we would die. So there is the fear of being killed, which is, I think, innate in all of us, but it's not horrific. I don't want to encounter a great white shark, but not because I don't want to encounter them as an animal. I would not have any problems encountering them if I was in a cage and they were swimming around me. But I would have a problem, and I would be afraid of encountering them in the open seas without me being protected, because then I would run the risk of being killed. But that's not really horror. That's just fear for your life. And I have this, when I play role-playing games, fearing for my character's life is something that can happen. I've seen total party kills. I've seen people fall down into mines and get killed. I've seen people die in battle in RPGs. So it's not something that is unknown, but it doesn't inspire horror or terror. It's just I just don't. You try to avoid it. And so horror or terror is something that is, I believe, quite difficult to produce in role-playing games. And I think the reason is, and I've been thinking about this for a good while, because although I want to like Call of Cthulhu, I always think it's wrong to call it a horror role-playing game, because there is nothing horrific about the adventures that, for example, Chaosium has brought out. There is nothing horrific about them. Quite often they are actually quite ridiculous, because they don't just stop at subtle horror creeping up, but then they throw in a couple of mythos creatures, and when you read up on what they look like, and when you read the descriptions, you can't but laugh. They might be interesting for people who are Freudians and who want to explore H.P. Lovecraft's sexual proclivities, and I think they would have a field day there. But none of this is really, really horrific. So when you, for example, read the description of Wilbur Whateley once his clothes have been taken off, you kind of go, yeah, nobody would find that ridiculous. Nobody would find that horrific. They might find it disgusting, but it's not horrific. Horror is something different. Horror is something a lot more existential. Horror is something that happens to you because you are faced with something that overcomes you psychologically. Looking at something that looks very different, and Wilbur Whateley is quite tentacles, or even the even Cthulhu himself doesn't look horrific. He is horrific because he can kill you, but he looks like a big frog with wings, That might not say that I don't think he's disgusting looking, but he's not horrifying because of the way he looks. If he was just 10 centimeters tall, nobody would give a damn, Everybody would kind of go, oh, he's almost cute. It's like the fear demon in Buffy, who's like 10 centimeters tall, and she just squashes him, So, and he does look a little bit weird with his horns and everything. So, why do I think that horror games, horror RPGs are probably the most difficult to run? I think it is because there is a difference between what my character might find terrifying, and that's what happens in Call of Cthulhu 20s, where your characters are supposed to be totally afraid of the fact that there are outer gods out there, and we are not the pinnacle of existence in the universe, but that there are things out there that are much older, much more intelligent, and much more powerful than we are. That's not horrifying to me as a person. I totally believe that this might be the case. But I'm supposed to play a character that goes crazy at the thought. To me, that doesn't work. If I want to enjoy a horror role-playing game, I, as a player, need to be creeped out. And Call of Cthulhu doesn't do this. I have yet to find a Call of Cthulhu adventure that actually creeps me out. Interestingly enough, one of the stories that I find most disconcerting and most creepy of all of H.P. Lovecraft's work is The Color Out of Space, where you don't have a single extraterrestrial entity. You have a kind of, probably meteorite that strikes a place, named Gardner's Place, And you probably see the results of extreme radiation when you read what happens. How they all go crazy, how they all, how the plants die, how the animals die, and I think somebody also almost turns to ash. Or falls apart and turns to dust or something. That is radiation. I still don't know if actually Lovecraft knew about radiation back then, or if he was just basically making this up. But the whole atmosphere he creates in this story is so creepy that I really, really, really hate rereading it, because I know I'll be creeped out. I, as a person, as the reader, am creeped out by it. I'm not creeped out by Call of Cthulhu. I'm not creeped out by the Dunwich Horror. I'm not creeped out by... Well, I am a little bit creeped out by Shadows over Innsmouth, but not because of the Dagonites and of the Deep Ones, but because of the fact that the protagonist himself has actually descended from them and will turn into this into a deep sea dwelling creature. And the reason why this creeps me out is because I have a problem with the deep seas. I'm just afraid. I just fear being immersed in deep water. I love swimming. I don't have a problem with water. I don't have a problem with going, like on a boat. But this idea of being immersed in very deep waters, being inside the ocean, is something that I find terrifying. There is no reason why I should be terrified, because we know that the worst that can happen is and that's a bad one. You might encounter a shark and they might kill you, but there aren't any deep sea monsters out there. We are pretty sure of that now. But just the fact that I'm surrounded by this black mass and there is no light, and it's cold and it's inhospitable, is just really, really terrifying to me. It's just terrible. But that's why I'm afraid, or that's why the Shadow over Innsmouth creeps me out. Not because of the way that it's written, or probably not because, or in the way that Lovecraft wanted me to be creeped out. And I would really like to know if people who were reading Lovecraft at the time found his stories creepy. So I suppose that in order, if you want to creep people out in your horror RPG, you would have to find out a lot about your players. You would have to ask them, what creeps you out? What are you afraid of as a person? And then try and see if you can put this into the game. Because while it's not a problem for me to play a character, let's say a magician, I can't use magic because magic doesn't exist in our real world. But I can totally inhabit the body of a magic user, cast spells, and, see their in-game effects. But I find it impossible to play a character that is supposed to be afraid of something that leaves me cold. Where I'm like, yeah, this is not creepy. I'm not afraid, And so if I want to be enjoying a horror role-playing game, it has to be a game that deals with things that frighten me as the person who's the player. And I think that this is quite difficult to pull off, because unless you do a complete free-form improvised thing where everybody just tells the GM at the beginning, this is what I'm afraid of, and then the GM starts building a story around the different fears that people bring to the table. Or if you're using a predefined adventure, I think this is going to be quite difficult. So I actually don't think that the genre horror RPG works. You can call yourself a horror story, but you might not end up with a lot of people being terribly afraid of what's happening. And I find it's very difficult, if not impossible, for me as a player to fake fear in my character for prolonged periods of time. For example, if I have a character who has the flaw afraid of heights, when I am in a situation where I am suspended from a cliff face, or where I have to climb a ladder, I will be able to play this, but I would also probably, there might be a test involved. Okay, so you're afraid of heights. If you want to scale that wall, you have to pass a skill test, and it's more difficult. The difficulty is increased by 2. Okay, so you have a mechanic that basically translates the flaw that your character has into something that can work in game. If I am afraid of dragons, you could say, okay, or there may be monsters that strike fear into people, dragon fear maybe. So then you would say, okay, you have not been able to make your composure check, so you all suffer 1 level or 2 or 3 levels of fear, and they have an in-game effect by making things more difficult for you, or maybe even making it impossible for you to act for a couple of rounds. That's fine. But a horror role-playing game lives lives because people feel fear, and it's, to me, totally impossible to fake fear in a character, which is why I like how Call of Cthulhu 7th edition deals with insanity, where you have different levels of insanity. They even have nice little cards that you can buy and print off, or buy, I suppose you can also get them as real cards, but I bought them as a PDF and printed them off. And you basically draw one of them randomly, and then you are told how your fear or how your insanity manifests itself, what actually happens. That is a lot more powerful, or even the GM taking over the player character for a particular amount of time and then actually acting out his insanity. I find that a lot more convincing and also a lot more interesting than me saying, okay, well, I've now lost 10 points of sanity. According to the book, I'm now reduced to a gibbering mass sitting somewhere in the corner. And then you just sit there for a couple of rounds or maybe half an hour. But you as a player don't really feel anything. You're just sitting there. Whereas if the GM takes over your character and suddenly does lots of things with it, that can actually strike fear into someone else's heart. And there is one, I think it's called Red Mist, where you actually attack anyone and everyone around you. So you could end up attacking your own party. And that is something that I find is quite powerful. I would be very reluctant as a player to do this, but if you happen to go that insane, and if you happen to suffer from Red Mist, then the GM takes over, and you will be attacking people. And I think that, while it isn't horrific in and of itself, is a way of emulating this idea of fear and its results in the character. And I, as a player, actually am afraid that this might happen. So there is an element of fear there where I'm like, okay, well, if I follow this route, I might actually suffer insanity. So do I really want to go there? You really have a choice. And sometimes Call of Cthulhu games end in the middle because the characters are just like, I'm not going to stay. I don't want to see what's behind that corner. I don't want to read that book. I don't want to dig out any more of this secret because I've already had it. I don't want to go crazy. And you just hightail it out of there. And the story unfolds and, the evil might come to town and destroy everyone, but at least you got out. So I think that I'm still looking for an RPG that is actually horrifying, and it's called a horror RPG. And here I'm not talking about RPGs that basically exploit splatter. That's not horrific. Splatter isn't horrific, it's just disgusting. It doesn't inspire horror. You don't get creeped out if you see zombies. I just find zombies very disgusting. I'm also not creeped out by vampires, possibly because I know that they don't exist, and I just don't find them very horrifying beyond, they might kill me, which in and of itself is, of course, terrible, but it doesn't inspire horror. It doesn't creep me out. So I'm still looking for that one RPG or that one adventure or that one setting that truly inspires horror in me, where I go in and I'm afraid to look around the corner, and I know that I need to push on because maybe there's somebody behind me, maybe I need to go someplace, maybe I need to escape, but I'm truly afraid of what I will discover. If anyone out there has any settings or knows of any adventures that I could check out that provide this kind of horror, I would be very, very interested. And you can just post it in the comments. But until such time as somebody provides me with something, I have to say that whenever somebody says, oh yeah, let's play a horror RPG, I'm like, yeah, no. Because I usually, so far in the past, I've always come away disappointed. Because I was never really creeped out. That doesn't mean that it can't be done. It just means it hasn't happened to me yet. So that's all from me for today from RPG Kittens and Keeps, and I'll talk to you soon. Bye bye.